Hey everyone, welcome to the new episode of the podcast. Sorry I'm a bit late posting. Janina is still not here and it's been almost 2 weeks and honestly I miss my wife. That does not help me work I know it's just 2 weeks, right? But this is the longest we've been separated since we've been together and honestly it's affecting me. Autistic people made for life, man. Especially the way the world is today, like I don't receive much feedback on YouTube or the thing that I do, and it's actually very, very taxing. So it's making my work a little bit harder. I'm not complaining, I love what I do, but I'm explaining why, unfortunately, I haven't been as consistent as I would like to be. And on top of it, Janina provides me, she's the structure part of the relationship, let's put it this way, right? So anyway, I shall do a better job, but she's coming back. She's leaving for Brazil on Tuesday, and so my life will go back to normal, and I'm very happy about that. Anyway, today I want to talk about something really important. Actually, it's a concept that has been spinning in one of the rooms of the Mind Palace for a while now, and like I pull from very different subjects. I'm sure you'll know that, and once in a while they come together. Right? Because at the end, I think, and that was a quote from Emerson, right? There are very few principles. And there is a simplicity in nature. It seems that nature finds a beauty in simplicity, as Dirka, the physicist, said. And I think there's a concept here that is, first of all, beautiful in its simplicity, but I think extremely important and extremely powerful. And so this is what I'm going to do a set of podcasts on this, a set of episodes, so I can really go deep into that rabbit hole. Today I'm going to lay down the foundation of this idea that I just made a post on Instagram about, and we're going to go deeper into that rabbit hole. I believe it's one of those extremely important moments within Strongfit. I think internal torque, external torque was one of them, and I think this is one of those because it explains so much. That idea explains so much. It makes me think. It makes me believe this is correct. I've been at it for a while now, and I have a good grasp on it now, and so I want to share it. So the idea starts first of all always with the idea that the body is predictive, not reactive, right? This will be very important. So it's a very Fristonian idea as usual, right? Which I believe is the correct way of looking at the world, at life anyway. And we're going to start with what is called affective immunology. So if you go in the Strongfit Vault, there's a paper called Affective Immunology, where emotions and the immune response converge, by Fulvio D'Acquisito. And so it's the guy wants to create a field called affective immunology. That's what he's working on, and the concept is gorgeous. It's the idea that the immune response system and the emotional response system mirror each other, in the sense that he explains it as mirroring each other. I will go a step past that, and say that they're the same thing, that they both have a certain plasticity that we're going to talk about, that tells me that it's the same system. But let me read what he says so that you understand where he's coming from and what the beginning of my point is. Similar to affect, so emotional response, the immune response is the tool the body uses to interact with the external environment. So that's a very interesting point already. They're saying that the immune response system and the emotional response system are tools to interact with the outside world. So even though they're both inside, they are all tools to deal with the outside world. So already we're thinking Markov blanket. And more importantly, we're thinking that then the immune response system and the emotional response system are learning behaviors. Right, they both serve for the same. They are both learning behaviors. So, thanks to the emotional and immunological response, we learn to distinguish between what we like and what we do not like, to counteract a broad range of challenges, and to adjust to the environment we are living in. Right. So again, that would mean they are learning system. is it possibly that they are the same learning system, that they both are that Markov blanket between the inside and the outside, how we deal with the outside. Recent compelling evidence has shown that the emotional and immunological systems share more than a similarity of functions. So let's read it, it's great. I'm just going to get the part that I want to get to for today. Studies over the last few decades have provided sufficient evidence for similarities and overlaps between the immune and emotional responses. First and foremost, affective immunology is a framework of research based on two fundamental assumptions. The immune and emotional system mirror each other. Both the immunological and emotional responses are dynamic and continuously changing. The first assumption is based on a large body of both clinical and experimental evidence showing an increased incidence of emotional disorders in patients suffering from immune diseases. We're going to get to that. And an increased susceptibility to immune diseases in patients suffering from mental disorders. That's going to be a whole, I'm going to get to it, but that's going to be a whole podcast in itself. Again, because I need to take this step by step. The second assumption is based on the new and emerging ideas that both the emotional and immune systems are highly plastic. The term plasticity has been used to indicate the ability to change and adjust continuously depending on the external factors or living conditions. Right, so let's go out of that. So first of all, plasticity, they don't just mean you're changing your mood. That means that your emotional response system is changing, not the emotions, right? That's not the same. So that means that your immune system can go from an autoimmune disease type to clear of it. We have seen that, for example, when I don't know if you guys remember on podcast, but I had the cases of separate people that were very lactose intolerant, telling me that after a burn the question workout, they could actually even drink milk and have zero reaction whatsoever. I had that many times over, like at least 10, 15 different cases of people telling me that. Sympathetic reactions, right? Which is what an autoimmune disease is. It's overly in the sympathetic, a bit like like an immune response system is good. When it goes too far, it's bad. A bit like leukemia, right? White globals help you fight things. If they start killing everything, it's a bad thing. Same idea. So the plasticity here is to say that the system is different. That you can be, for example, lactose intolerant, and then that you could fix it to the point where you can have dairies. We have seen that with the protocol. The protocol has helped people that had autoimmune diseases mostly get rid of it, and even being able to introduce certain food that were prior impossible to have. So that means that the plasticity would be the same thing for an emotional response system, that you can maybe identify yourself as more depressed or anxious or stuff like that, but that is actually only a state, and that state can be changed. So whatever your set of emotional responses to situations are right now, we could change that, literally transforming into what society would call a different person. That's what they mean by plasticity, really. So then obviously brings the question, what is me? And that's another podcast altogether, but you get the idea. So again, I'm going to do a podcast on all this, but I want to start with the idea of immune response system, emotional response system are the same. That is not his position, that would be mine, right? I believe they are actually the same system. They are both representation of the same learning system. One is more physiological, while the other one is more whatever you want to call the emotional response system to be. All right, so emotion and immune response system. Okay, so I'm going to take two of them, and compare them. Inflammation. Inflammation is part, obviously, of the immune system, right? I get cut, I get swelling. Why do I get swelling? Because the sympathetic system is engaging in order to provoke an inflammation that will help the healing process. You cannot heal without first inflaming. The inflammation also sends, all the white globals to the area so they can fight germs, fermenting, all that stuff. There's a swelling, there's water retention in this area so that the healing process can be more effective. That's going to be very, very important. Do not forget that part. inflammation is followed by healing. Inflammation is required to have healing. That's going to come in very handy later on. So, inflammation is there. So if inflammation and emotions are the same, what is the emotional equivalent to inflammation? What if that's anxiety? Why do I say that? Because if you look at the immune response system, inflammation, what is it? It's really on the sympathetic side, right? It's that pre-healing process. It's how the body reacts to an aggression. That's a fight and flight system, right? Something happens to the body, inflammation happens as a driver toward the sympathetic. Whenever you ingest a food, there's always a sympathetic response. There's always an inflammatory response to food. It's not because the food itself causes inflammation. It's because the body doesn't know what that food is yet, and so therefore prepares itself for an aggression. Back to that Fristonian idea of prediction versus observation, right? It is a predictive mechanism. Anything changes, sympathetic, just in case. Right. So, isn't that what anxiety is, though? Anxiety, you're never anxious about the past, only about the future. Anxiety is a predictive mechanism. And what is anxiety? It's a stress in the exact definition of the word, which means expenditure of energy. Anxiety is a driver toward the sympathetic side, which tells your body more energy needs to be spent, which happens in the sympathetic side. So exactly like inflammation. All right, so then that brings a very interesting idea. What happens when you push anxiety? You get panic attack, all right? What happens when you push inflammation? Well, you get an autoimmune disease. So is it possible that panic attacks are an autoimmune disease? See where I'm going with this? Or at least that they are mirroring each other, right? So is it that a panic attack is an autoimmune disease, or is it an autoimmune disease that causes the panic attack? What if they're the same thing? And that's really what I want to get to. What if a panic attack is just an inflammation, right? Of your system, not just of your body, but of your system. So that means of your body, obviously, but also of your mind. But in that case, the mind would simply be a mental representation of a physical state. Right? What if there is one state? What if there's not just a body state and then a mental state? What if they're the same thing? And in the case of emotions, they would be emotions would be a physical representation of the learning system that is life. So that would mean that a panic attack is like an autoimmune disease. Is overreacting to an event, which is really the autoimmune disease, right? It's an overreaction to whatever is happening. But if you look at panic attacks, most of the time, all the time, the reaction that you're having is not justified by the environment. That's why we call it a panic attack. If you were freaking out because a bear was coming at you, that'd be normal, right? But that's not what happens. Your panic attack, you don't even know why. You wake up and you go, nothing is wrong, and yet the world is coming to you. What if that panic attack is actually has nothing to do with you in the way we define it in society right now? We say panic attack is like, I need to calm down, I need to nasal breathe, I need to do all that. Right, but what if it's not, nasal breathing is not to calm down your mind? What if it's to calm down your body? Right? What if that panic attack is actually just an inflammation taking a hold of your body and going too far? Such an interesting idea. And this is what the podcast we're going to do later on is mental disorders and inflammation. You see people that have massive amount of anxiety always ended up with a lot of inflammation. Now, some people will say that, well, yeah, anxiety means energy being produced, and that has some deleterious effect on the body. That's a reactive way of looking, not reactive, that's a way of looking at the body that is body as a reactive mechanism, where actually it's a predictive mechanism. So again, that Fristonian idea allows us to make some connections that become very, very interesting. And for example, that made me think about the Dr. Jordan Peterson, right, who has a history of autoimmune disease in his family, like his father, but there's also a history of depression. And he was talking about the two that could be linked, but he didn't know how. What if they're not linked? What if they're the same thing? So again, going back to my idea of inflammation and healing, right? One always follows the other. That's always also how we learn. You ingest the information, you transform it into knowledge. Once you've ingested the information, you need a time to process it so that you can transform it into knowledge. That's the mind palace where information is always spinning in one of the rooms. It has to be decanted, right? Like it has to be like a cold brew, right? It has to come about, and then eventually you feel that knowledge being part of you, right? Almost like that epiphany feeling, but just over time. So what if actually that transformation of information into knowledge is the same idea of the swelling going into healing? So the knowledge would be the healing part, the end of the healing part, right? What if all systems work like that? All systems work in twos, they're all arches. So there's an interesting idea. So what would be depression? What if depression is forced healing then? What if depression is that you have amassed so much information that the body needs a full break to be able to process it? Just like when you've eaten too much, you need to lay down and let the digestive process happen. What if that's what's happening? What if depression is just that, because you ate too much? So ate too much of what? Well, in that case, of anxiety. That would explain anxious depression. That would explain Jordan Peterson, who's someone who has a temper, he has anger, he has a tendency to go too far in the sympathetic response, and out of that, at some point, needs to have a deeper healing phase. Just like the bigger the cut, right, the longer it's going to take to heal, the more energy is required toward healing. So there's an interesting concept for you, that the panic attacks, right, that are the end of the spectrum when it comes to anxiety, are at that stage like having the same effect as an autoimmune disease. So what does that mean? Well, it becomes very interesting in that sense, because it means that if it's an inflammation of the body going too far, then we know how to treat inflammation. For example, we were talking about training nasal breathing, right? And inflammation is on the sympathetic side. So whenever I activate the parasympathetic side, right, in that case, that's going to act as a brake on the sympathetic side. So that would mean, for example, that going toward a crash toward the parasympathetic, not crash in a negative way, but for example, doing nasal breathing, doing cyclical training, things like this would act as a blocker on the sympathetic. That brings a very interesting point, because one of my coaches was asking me a very important question the other day. He had two clients with long COVID. So, like they have the lungs that are constantly aching, right? Very inflamed, so very much on the sympathetic. And every time he makes them do the oblique opener, their lungs don't hurt when they do CrossFit. And they were asking why. Is it possible that the oblique opener, being the base of the arch for the parasympathetic side, being in internal torque, promotes that parasympathetic side, therefore blocking the sympathetic side, therefore blocking part of the inflammation on the lungs, which would explain why they have no pain, amongst other things. Such an interesting idea, right? So the whole idea here would be that inflammation is the same as anxiety in that sense. Like, words are always going to screw us here, because we all associate different ideas to different things. But we know what the inflammation is. That's simple. What if that's what we call anxiety? And so that would explain why some anxiety is good, just like some inflammation is good, but too much anxiety goes toward what is an autoimmune disease. Interesting. And again, then we know how to deal with that. That would explain what the protocol works. Because the protocol, obviously, is to help with circadian rhythm. But if you see, during the day, we have the sympathetic, but at night, I'm working very, very hard in going toward the parasympathetic side. That's another connection. And then for today, the last connection that I want to do before I start breaking this down in parts in other podcast is lactate. So I've been working really hard on lactate for, what has it been, like a year or two now? I always think it's 6 months, but I'm thinking a year. That probably means it's 2 years. And orexin neuron and all that stuff, there was a number of ideas in there. One thing is for sure, lactate is a fuel, and it's on the sympathetic side. So I was talking about my client Nicole and other clients that we did the lactate testing on, and we always saw very high levels of lactate, right, in the case of very high anxious moment relating to the sense of self. Another learning mechanism. That's for another podcast. That's because this goes deep and deep and deep. So what if, so that level of lactate, we see it. So anxiety means energy being produced, fuel is being produced. We see high levels of lactate. We see a high level of lactate that go too high, actually, and then we see a crash after that. Back to my autoimmune disease, which is all the way up. So we could see that the inflammation and lactate have a role to play with each other, and then eventually you go into force healing. So high levels of lactate generating specific behavior, we know that one, going into force healing. And a part that I find very interesting in there is that we know that lactate act as an anti-inflammatory. So inflammation goes up, anxiety goes up, they're the same thing. Anxiety goes up, lactate is being produced as fuel. Lactate is being produced as fuel, act as an anti-inflammatory. That is one very, very interesting cycle, isn't it? Right? So there's a relationship there that needs to be developed as well, which would explain why the lactate goes up so much when we see those crises of anxiety. They might be lactate might be working primarily as an anti-inflammatory then, or at least as part of the equation. What is very interesting in this is that's what we see out of the SSRIs, the serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Is that they say it's all about serotonin, but actually all SSRIs are anti-inflammatories. And we saw, and then I talked about it in the podcast I did with obesity, that inflammation and depression are linked on many levels. So inflammation, obesity, depression, anxiety, what if it's the same thing? Then that would explain a lot of things about obesity and the mental condition associated with it as well. So we can see again the role of inflammation is so important, but what if it goes even further? So that's what I want to talk about in the next set of podcasts, is the relationship between inflammation and anxiety in the context of affective immunology, how it relates to lactate, and more importantly then, what does it mean for programming, right? Exercises, nutrition. How do we tackle nutrition? How do we tackle anxiety? You know how we tackle it? By tackling inflammation. That's a lot simpler to do. That we know how to do. So, here it comes. Thank you guys.